Welcome to another podcast for Net Zero Carbon, this time on our Chapter 4 guides, looking at reducing emissions, which I notice are split into three parts, Scope 1, Scope 2 and Scope 3. And I'm here talking to the author of those guides, Nick. Take us through that. Why is it structured in this way?
Hi, Jeremy. So Chapter 4, we've written just to talk about reducing emissions. And it might seem strange that it's broken into three documents, each covering Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 emissions. Now, for those who aren't sure what those terms mean, Scopes 1, 2, and 3 are the categories of emissions that were developed by the GHG Protocol, which is the leading carbon accounting framework for inventorying greenhouse gas emissions in the context of businesses and organizations. Now, the preceding three chapters on netzerocarbon.com, in my view, set up an understanding of business decarbonization and then introduce to readers key concepts, introduce them to key organizations in corporate sustainability that really set them up to think about emissions and quantify emissions in line with these three scopes. So the intention with this new chapter is to present business emissions reduction measures in the language that's been used on the website up until that point. So that's why we've structured it this way. And there's some commonalities between the three documents, which again is intended to be all consistent language.
Right, and just to recap, Scope 1 emissions, those are the things directly under a business's control, emissions that occur on their premises or from their vehicles. Scope 2 is the indirect emissions from their energy supplies, the electricity that they use and so on. And Scope 3, the wider emissions associated with their stakeholders and supply chains. And that's the basic breakdown. But from what you say, there are some common sort of generic approaches to each of those scopes which you recommend. Is that right?
That's right. So you've given a good definitions of Scope 1, 2, and 3 there. But what I'd add is that if documents addressing Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions were produced, it's quite easy to imagine them being dozens, if not 100 pages long each. Now, we've been very general in our descriptions of measures that can be used to reduce emissions across each of these scopes. Now, a business that's considering its options for decarbonization is going to be producing a list of potential changes, which is as unique as the business that's considering them itself. But what we've tried to show in these three guides, which I think is an important point to make, is that there are common categories of measures that can be taken in each, more or less. In Scope 1, we describe technological options for reducing Scope 1 emissions. And we also describe organizational options for reducing Scope 1 emissions. Similarly, in Scope 2, we describe technological options. Behavioral options are also a component of Scope 2 emissions reductions, and I should add they're also a component of Scope 1 emissions reductions. One of the options that's unique to Scope 2 is contractual options, and you might expand on this a little bit, but this refers to the market-based approaches when energy users make changes to the kind of energy that they are purchasing to reduce their Scope 2 emissions. Now, in Scope 3, we take a slightly different look at the categories of emissions reductions, and we describe them as operational changes that can be made. But more broadly, policy-based changes that affect Scope 3 emissions. So we're being very general in our view of the methods to reduce emissions in each of these scopes, and recognizing that they can be categorized in different ways.
Indeed, and you mentioned the Scope 2 contractual situation and the arrangements firms might have with suppliers of green or low carbon energy. And I guess this could include power purchasing agreements or supplies that are related to guarantees of origin for renewable energies. Is that the sort of thing you're talking about there?
That's right. So these are unique within Scope 2 emissions reductions. There's some scope for market-based emissions reductions in Scope 1, but it's is not currently in the greenhouse gas protocol guidance. But Scope 2 emissions reductions that are market-based in nature, like I said, are derived from an organization making changes to the kind of energy it buys. So that's what makes it contractual. You're not changing your energy consumption. You're not necessarily changing your use of that energy or how much of it that you're consuming. What you're doing is changing the nature of the energy that you buy itself, and that's evidenced in the contracts that you have for that energy. And the methods that I describe in that document are green energy tariffs, which involve the purchase of REGOs, or Renewable Energy Guarantees of Origin, which are contractual instruments that guarantee that the energy that you've purchased is from a zero carbon source, or a CPPA, a Corporate Power Purchase Agreement, which is a contracting instrument that's been around for the past 10 years, which, if I were to give the briefest comparison with the more traditional energy contracting regime that businesses will have been used to, is that a CPPA involves direct contracting between a consumer and a generator, rather than the traditional arrangement where a consumer contracts with an energy supplier, which purchases energy off of a generator. And power purchase agreements have existed for a very long time, but have been introduced as an option for business users of energy only in the last 10 or so years, and are growing in popularity. But that's quite a bit of an aside. I think the important point to make regarding the categorizations of emissions reductions methods that we've presented in each of these three documents is that whether they're showing that they're technological, behavioral, operational, policy-based changes, organizational changes, it shows that emissions reductions have methods that are implemented across all kind of scales of the business. They're implemented tactically, they're implemented strategically. They can involve a diversity of staff within an organization, everyone from the company leadership down to operational staff are responsible and have ownership over and responsibility for the success of the emissions reduction methods that could be chosen by a business. So we're just trying to get across that the thinking around emissions reductions is broad in scope and involves an entire organization.
Well, Nick, thank you for explaining that complex subject as simply as I think you probably could do under the circumstances. And let's hope the guides prove useful to those who are looking to implement this within their own business. So thank you very much for that. Well, for anyone listening, I hope you found that useful too. Do look out for our updates, which will be coming onto the website in due course. And we hope you visit us again on Net Zero Carbon very soon.